Phil Koltun, who has been with the Linux Foundation recently. He's with the Linux Foundation still, but he's more part-time than full-time, we have learned. He's been instrumental in the open source compliance program activity that we see as very, very important for MARSA and for the whole community to understand how can we be compliant with open source licenses and include it in products that we actually charge for. How can we make business out of open source? Because there's a lot of misconceptions out there. People say open source must be for free. Open source must be dangerous because you can hack into it. It must be low quality. All of this is wrong. So we had Zach attending his course in San Francisco in May, I think it was. And he loved it. So he said, we have to bring Phil over. He called Phil and he said yes. And here he is, Phil Koltun.
So when you hear the term compliance, I think many people may get this image of a police function. And that's not really the message that we want to convey here. Compliance is really an enabling factor that enables companies to get the benefit of using open source when they understand the obligations, the license obligations they must comply with. So think of it as opening doors rather than closing doors. My goal for today is to help you understand some of the basics about open source compliance and to understand what additional things you need to understand. So let's see.
It's on the side. It's on the side. It's not very compliant, this one. Press it like, press it up. Press it up on the side. Maybe you can have from the back.
Let's just advance from the back. Next slide, please. Thank you. Let's go past that. Next slide, please. Next slide. There. So after I started listening yesterday, started thinking more about the MARSEC community, I think of at least 3 scenarios to be concerned with. One is that clearly you're engaged in software development and produce software for others to use. Back, please. Thank you. Second is that communities and companies will want to contribute code to the MARSEC and MARSA baselines and the projects that you get going here. And third is that companies will want to use the community software in their commercial products. So as you listen to the remainder of the talk, you may keep these scenarios in mind. Each of them requires some compliance actions. I won't try to spell out exactly everything that people might need to do, but try to keep at least one of these perspectives in mind as we go forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what does the open source development community look for? First, of course, great software. But second, very, very basic, freedom. The freedom to use software, to study it, to copy it, to modify it, and to redistribute it. And so the freedoms are just very basic to the whole community. Attribution, as Jim spoke, so that people get recognition for their contributions. Because they're often not getting paid directly, they want the recognition that comes with it. Certainly the communities look for contributions to enhance the software and make it more and more useful as time goes by. And last but not least, compliance with license obligations, because it's the compliance that really enables the freedoms for everybody else to use. Next slide, thank you. So when I speak of an open source compliance program, what I mean by the term at least is the combination or aggregate of company policies, processes, training, and tools that enable organizations to make good use of open source, contribute to open communities, at the same time respecting copyrights, complying with obligations, and protecting the organization's intellectual property rights and that of its customers and suppliers. So it's more than just a term, it's an entire combination of things that enables this to occur. So when we talk about license obligations, just to convey or inform the basic notions. One is a set of notices, and the notices, depending on what the license says, may appear in user documentation, may appear in the user interface, either as a splash screen or a pull-down menu. And typically the notices convey acknowledgement that the product contains open source, identifying what open source and what licenses they're under, attributions of those who made the contributions, any limitations of warranty. So typically the people want the software to be used, but they don't want to be liable for any damage or harm that occurs. Copyright information, who are the copyright holders, and the license, including the license text. And the purpose of all this is to enable the people that receive the code to know the freedoms they can enjoy. If you don't know what is the license and what does it provide, then you can't really understand the freedoms that you have for that software. Next slide, please. And then depending on the license involved, it may specify that you have to provide source code for the original open source that's put into the product, any modifications to the source code, perhaps source code that's combined with this might also be provided. So either, and depending again on the license involved, the original source, modifications, and anything combined into a single whole with that software. And then as well, scripts for compiling, building, and linking the code. And the purpose of all this is to enable people that receive the product to enjoy the benefits that others have derived from the software. The last point even about scripts for compiling, building, and linking the code, if a company has some special scripts and utilities, build procedures that are needed to compile the code and rebuild it and have it work, and they provide the source but not that special sauce, if you will, that goes with it, then they really haven't provided freedom to people to take advantage of the software. So just keep in mind the idea of freedom and what must be provided so that others can enjoy the same freedom that you and your company enjoyed when downloading the software. Next slide. A point about when the license obligations apply, and there's some misunderstandings about this point. License obligations apply when an organization distributes products externally. If a company downloads open source and uses it only on an internal basis, there are no obligations. There's no compliance, because there's a freedom to download and to use the software. It's only when you externally distribute the software to others that obligations are triggered. And again, companies often misunderstand this point. The United States government, I think, has taken a very interesting position, which is that any download or distribution of the software within the U.S. government does not constitute external distribution, therefore no obligations are triggered. Very interesting perspective. The last bullet point here, that you may need some legal advice to determine which actions constitute external distribution. For instance, when companies have a prototype, perhaps of a consumer device that they're developing, and they have some open source in the prototype device, and they want to hand the prototype to a potential customer to use, does that action constitute external distribution, thereby triggering obligations? Questions like that really require some legal guidance, and obviously I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to give an opinion on that point. But the important takeaway from this slide is that if you're just using the software internally, then the obligations are not triggered. And in terms of the MARSEC organization, you can download software, you can use it for the project, for the experimental purposes that you're going through, and typically that would not trigger obligations. It's only when you externally distribute the software to others that the obligations kick in. Next slide, please. So it's important to at least talk a little bit about possible consequences of noncompliance. I obviously don't want to speak in terms of risk or danger or to concern people about using open source or to create FUD around the use of open source. But people that truly are violators of license obligations subject themselves to negative publicity and damage to community relationships. Community is very reluctant to work with companies that are clearly violators of open source licenses and to cooperate with them in any way. More to the point, from a financial standpoint, you face the loss of license. If you fail to comply with obligations, the licenses often specify that you lose the right to use that software, which would mean you then are unable to ship product, or if you have products out in the field already, you may have to withdraw them from the marketplace. And so there can be significant impact from a profit and loss perspective if that occurs. And in the extreme example in which a company is actually sued for violation of copyright, there could be financial damages and remedial actions that they have to take, which typically include creating a compliance program, appointing a compliance officer, and all the things that we would advocate you do anyway. So the title of the talk talked about challenges across the supply chain. And the reason that supplier compliance is so important is that an organization bears responsibility for compliance on all the open source in its products. So suppose that your company takes open source software from some other organization, from a supplier, and then releases a product. Who bears the responsibility for compliance? You can't point to the supplier and say, go see them, they're responsible, because you're the company that distributed the product. And so it's the company that distributes products to others that bears the responsibility. The implication of this, of course, is that you have to understand the open source in the software that your people develop, but also in the software that you obtain from external suppliers. And it's a chain of events. If you get software from a supply company and you ask them about the open source that they are using, they have to be aware of any open source that comes from suppliers to them and suppliers to them and so on. It's an entire supply chain. So an organization must get its suppliers to disclose open source contained in its deliverables and also ask them to provide what's needed for compliance. And again, in those scenarios that I presented, if it's the MARSEC organization developing software and downloading open source from community sites and getting contributions from companies that are working with them, they have to understand what open source is contained in those products they receive. Next slide. So why can compliance be a challenge? And this is just a handful of ideas. Who knows what's in the code? Who knows what's in the code? See, put the emphasis on different words in that sentence. If you have software that could be several million lines of code, and we heard mention earlier that some of these sailing vessels, ships now, have millions of lines of code, it's very likely that no one individual is going to understand the entire contents of that software. And some of the software will have been around for 10 years and more. And the people that originally developed the code are no longer around even to ask where did it come from and what's in there. So knowing what's in the code can be a significant challenge. Second, there's no official arbiter or reference that you can turn to tell you where the software in question originally came from. And it may be the fact that you find some useful open source, and that open source was originally developed by one community, picked up by another, modified in some way, picked up by another community, picked up by another community. And so when you look for matches to that particular software package, you may find hits against a half dozen or a dozen different community sites. Perhaps the licensing changed along the way, and now the question is one of kind of forensic analysis or provenance analysis. Where did the software originally come from, and what's the true licensing for that software? And unfortunately, there's no authority that you can go to that officially tells you this is what it is. And ultimately, that may be an ownership question or a copyright ownership question that's really subject to legal analysis. And the last point is, and this borders on that area where people might be concerned or have some risk to manage. When companies build products using software under the GPL license or some other reciprocal license, one of those that says, not only do you have to provide source for the original software, but for anything combined with it. so closely linked that the software becomes an integral whole entirely subject to that same GPL license. Care must be taken to assure that any proprietary intellectual property does not become subject to such license. So maybe your company has some proprietary property, intellectual property. You have to be careful if you're using it in a system that also uses software under the GPL, that no such linkage occurs that the entire whole is subject to the GPL license. Otherwise, if you're distributing that product, what you had intended to keep proprietary may now be subject to this open source license. So some analysis is really needed to understand what licenses are involved and how are you using that software and what are the linkages, if any, to software from your own company or from your suppliers or business partners that you intended to keep proprietary. So here's a simple general model of open source compliance. And if you keep an eye on the middle row, there are three basic elements of compliance. One is what I call disclosure and discovery, finding out what open source is in your code. A second is a review and approval step, where knowledgeable people, typically referred to as an open source review board or OSRB, review the intended use, look at architectural dependency diagrams, understand the licenses that are involved, and determine whether that's an acceptable use of the open source. And then the satisfaction of obligations, the provision of the notices and the source code if necessary. So the disclosure and discovery step produces, an open source bill of materials, and that kind of flows through the rest of the steps. Next slide, please. If you're engaging the use of software suppliers, they're providing software to you, what things do you need to ask them to disclose? Well, there's probably more than just this simple table, but this is certainly a good starting point. What is the package what are the open source packages that they're including, and what version of the open source package are they using? And the version is certainly important because over time, it's possible that the licensing of the package could change. What is the source of the source code? Where did it come from? So that you can go back to the original source, you can examine it yourself, you can compare it to the reported license to you and see if you agree that it's the true license for that software. You want to know the license name and the license version. And again, over time, some of the licenses have changed in their details and their versioning, so you need to know what license and version it is. And you need to have access to the license text. Often the license text might be included in the source code itself as a comment or in a particular file. Sometimes you have to go to the community website to find the text of the license. You want to know if the code has been modified along the way, so if that license requires you to provide modifications in addition to the original open source, you know about your responsibility. And you need to understand how that software is used, either through an architectural dependency diagram or a disclosure of the linkages between that open source, other open source, and other proprietary software. Thank you. So you can ask your engineers to disclose to you what is the open source. You can send an email around, you can send a spreadsheet, say fill in the table, but to really know what's in the code, companies use scanning tools. There are at least 4 commercial companies, those listed here, that have very powerful products that scan through source code and report out the open source that's contained and the licensing and the community from which the project or the code was found. These companies, the technique works, perhaps you're familiar with antivirus software, where constantly the database of virus signatures is being updated. Well, these companies have spying programs and teams that constantly are on the lookout for new open source projects and pull those projects into their knowledge bases and have proprietary algorithms for taking signatures from those open community projects. And then you scan your source code and the tools go against this huge knowledge base of project signatures and report back to you every hit, every match that they found. and typically are able to show you side by side the highlighted lines of code down to a handful of lines of code, a snippet of the code, sometimes a full package, sometimes multiple files, sometimes individual lines of code, and they'll show you side by side the lines of code in your source and the lines of code in the community projects that matched, and usually they have a rocking function that enables you to look backwards and forward to see the extent of the match that occurred. And then along with the community project, it will tell you the license and have the text of the license, so you can really start to determine what was the true origin of this code and what is the licensing that applies. Of course, the challenge here is at least twofold. One is, can you get a supplier to provide source code? And often when there's a proprietary technology, they'll only give you object code. They won't give you the source because that's their key intellectual property. And second, these commercial tools cost a fair bit of money. And if you're a shoestring kind of operation, maybe you don't have the money to buy licenses for the tools. So at least some open source alternatives for the compliance tools exist. The Fossology project was started by Hewlett-Packard Company and now falls under the Linux Foundation umbrella. And it's an open source tool for discovering open source content in a source code base. It operates somewhat differently than the commercial tools in that it does not have this huge knowledge base of signatures that's constantly being updated, but uses regular expressions to look for keywords in the source code comments, words like license or GPL or copyright or other words of that kind, or looks at the file names themselves for file names that are typically used for license kinds of information. OpenLogic is one of those commercial companies that has a commercial tool, but they also have a less powerful open source version of that tool. Antipedia has a community tool. Binary analysis tool is more a research effort coming out of the Netherlands, but it tries to look at binary and kind of discover the open source that must have produced that object code. It's not nearly as powerful as the source code analysis tools. So even if a supplier doesn't have the money to pay for one of the commercial tools, then there may be some alternatives that you can use, and tomorrow perhaps we can talk about some strategies for gaining access to even the commercial tools. There's another work group that was formed by the Linux Foundation called SPDX. And SPDX stands for Software Package Data Exchange. The goal of the work group is to come up with a standard format for exchanging software bill of material information between companies. So rather than having spreadsheets and each company asking for different information, they want to determine a standard way of exchanging that information that's both human readable and machine readable. And each of those 4 commercial companies that I showed on the earlier slide are already committed and in some cases have already implemented the SPDX spec. So in addition to churning out a report that communicates the open source that's found, they can produce a bill of materials in this SPDX format. So over time, we expect that SPDX will be a standard way for companies to exchange this kind of information, and very much the same kind of idea that commercial manufacturing companies use bill of materials for hardware parts. So in terms of what to require of suppliers, I said before, disclosure, what open source content is in there, but in addition, satisfaction of obligations. So if your company or your organization is the one distributing software and responsible for compliance, then not only do you have to satisfy the obligation yourself, but you'd better get from your suppliers whatever you're going to need to satisfy the obligation. So you want to make sure that whatever notices or source code you will need to satisfy obligation, you get from your suppliers for the software that they provide to you. Excellent. And this is the last slide, but typically when organizations get started with a compliance initiative and try to set in place that open source compliance program, they ask, where do I start? And most typically the very first action would be to assign an individual to be responsible for compliance. It's very typical. If I know that my employment, my continued employment, relies on my company's products being compliant, then I'm going to think through and plan very carefully to do what's needed. Perhaps this would be a full-time position in a large enough company, and the compliance officer would be the face of open source to the entire community. But certainly it could be a part-time responsibility depending on the scale of open source being used. Next steps after that would typically be surveying open source that's in use, whether it's that email and spreadsheet and just asking people to tell you what they know about, or acquiring a commercial tool and going more deeply, find out what you're using, and it can be a great surprise along the way, and then establish a policy, a position statement that says we're going to enable open source, we want to take advantage of open source, but here are the things that we expect our employees to do so that we can truly take advantage of what's there. So the training that Geir made reference to, that Zach attended, was a one-day training. More often in the past, when I've visited a commercial company, we've provided 2 days of training to walk through all the details, and this is just a quick sample of what's here. But if there's one message that I really want to communicate here, is that compliance is not something to be scared about. Compliance can be easily understood, but it does have some challenges because of the huge code base that people have. Understanding what open source is there and understanding where it came from and what licenses apply is a non-trivial task. And certainly for a product that maybe you have a handset that has 5 to 10 million lines of code in it, and compliance has never been done before, it's not a simple undertaking to really understand the obligations. But once you've established that compliance baseline, every time somebody changes the software, then you continually update the compliance, and it's really pretty easy to do. So I encourage people to use open source. I don't want them to be scared about it. I want them just to understand the responsibility and enable the effective use of open source. That's it.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Phil. We actually would have loved to ask you some questions, but we know that you offered to do an extended, demystified version tomorrow. So for those of you that consider to get into this and want to know more details, we strongly suggest that after lunch tomorrow you join the session with Phil, who will give then sort of the intermediate between this talk and the full training. So please join us tomorrow. Thank you. Now, it's a true honor to introduce another icon in the business, Professor Anthony Wasserman. He's currently